Danielle Rhodes, a poised black attorney who became the target of Officer Greg Lawson's brutal racism. She wasn't speeding, wasn't breaking the law, just walking home when red and blue lights lit up the street. Greg, known for harassing minorities, barked orders, twisted her arm, and threw her into holding like she was nothing. But what he didn't know was who she really was. What happened next will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more stories that expose the truth and demand justice. It was nearly midnight when Danielle Rhodes, sharp, composed, and fresh off a late legal strategy session, stepped onto the quiet sidewalk of Willow Street, her heels clicking softly in the night. She was just blocks from home, thinking about an upcoming federal corruption case, unaware that within minutes she would become the latest victim of the very injustice she fought against every day. Suddenly, the silence shattered. Blinding red and blue lights exploded behind her, casting her shadow across the pavement. A squad car skidded to a stop. "You there? Hands where I can see them!" barked a voice dripping with authority and prejudice. Danielle froze. Not out of fear, but recognition. She knew that tone, that voice, the way it cracked like a whip, meant to strip dignity before a name was even asked. Officer Greg Lawson stepped out, his hand already on his holster, face twisted in suspicion. To him, she was just another black woman out late. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm, her hands clearly visible. "You match the description of a suspect," he snapped. "What description is that?" she asked. His smirk said it all. "Black female, alone, at night." Just like that. No further explanation. No investigation, just assumption. Greg didn't wait for her to respond. He lunged, yanking her arm, twisting it painfully behind her back. "You people think you're so clever," he growled as he shoved her against the car. "Always mouthing off." Danielle winced, but said nothing. She had studied men like him. Arrogant. Untouchable. The kind who thought their badge made them gods, and she knew that if she resisted, it would only escalate. So she let him cuff her, let him parade her through the station like a trophy, let him toss her in a holding cell like a criminal. And through it all, she never said her name, never revealed who she was. Because Danielle wasn't just any woman. She was a federal prosecutor, Harvard-educated, and she had spent the last 18 months secretly gathering evidence on a growing list of corrupt officers. Greg Lawson among them. And now, she had something better than a folder of witness reports. She had lived it. She had the first-hand experience, and she had a plan. The next morning, the station's front desk rang with an urgent call, then another, and another. Phones rang off the hook. Within the hour, Danielle was released without a single charge, her file mysteriously wiped clean. But the whispers began. Who was she? What just happened? In the captain's office, Greg Lawson strolled in with his usual swagger, expecting praise. "Some mouthy woman last night," he said, barely looking up. The captain's face was pale. He slid a folder across the desk. "That mouthy woman, Samem, is Danielle Rhodes, federal prosecutor. She's been building a case against dirty cops. Your name is on her list." Greg's face drained of color. And it only got worse. Security cameras from the arrest? Already in the hands of internal affairs, dashcam footage uploaded to federal servers, and Greg's own body cam capturing every racist insult? Sealed evidence. He had walked right into her trap. But Danielle wasn't done. She didn't want just one man taken down. She wanted the whole corrupt machine to burn. In the courtroom, the press packed the benches, the buzz deafening. The world was watching. Greg took the stand, nervous now, stripped of his smirk. And when Danielle stood, wearing a tailored navy suit and a face of absolute calm, the room shifted. She played the footage. Greg slamming her into the car, calling her "you people," ignoring her every civil right. Audible gasps filled the room. Jurors leaned forward. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Do you recognize this footage, Officer Lawson?" she asked. Greg stammered, sweat beading. The prosecution built their case like a fire. Victims testified. Officers turned on Greg to save themselves. And Danielle? She remained unflinching, unstoppable. She spoke with the quiet fury of someone who had waited too long for this moment. When the guilty verdict was read, Greg didn't just hang his head, he collapsed. The man who once saw himself as untouchable was now being led away in chains. Danielle watched without a smile, but with something stronger: resolve. Because this wasn't the end. This was the spark. Her victory made headlines across the country. News outlets hailed her bravery. Communities once silenced by fear began speaking out. Victims who had suffered quietly under corrupt officers started contacting her office. And Danielle welcomed every story, every case, every voice. With Greg's conviction, she gained leverage. Judges reopened old files. Whistleblowers stepped forward. Officers once protected by silence were now exposed by truth. One wrongful arrest had become a movement. And behind it all was Danielle Rhodes, the woman they underestimated, the black woman they thought they could break. She turned pain into power, injustice into justice. And every step forward she took was a warning to those still hiding behind their badges. She's coming. And she's not alone. It was supposed to be just another walk home, another night navigating the quiet, dimly lit streets, after staying late to prepare a federal case meant to bring justice to the families of those silenced by the badge. But for Danielle Rhodes, it turned into a night she would never forget. Not because it was her first time facing racism, but because this time, she decided to do something no one saw coming. The sting of what happened that night didn't begin with flashing red and blue lights, or the command to "put your hands where I can see them." No, it began years earlier, with every case she'd ever studied of innocent black men and women stopped, searched, and shattered by men like Officer Greg Lawson. It began with every courtroom where she watched victims fumble their words while officers smiled behind polished uniforms. It began with every closed-door meeting where she was told to pick her battles, to let it go, to not ruffle feathers. And it all came crashing down when Lawson pulled beside her and barked at her like she was subhuman. "You! Hands up! Now!" His voice was sharp, slurred with authority that had never been earned. Danielle, wearing a long navy coat and heels, turned slowly, keeping her hands visible. Her heart beat like a war drum, not in fear, but rage. "Officer, is there a problem?" she asked, measured. Lawson stepped out with his hand already resting on his weapon. His eyes scanned her skin, not her face. "You match a suspect," he said casually, his mouth twisting into a grin. "Black, female, out at night. Ring a bell?" Danielle's stomach tightened, not from surprise but from exhaustion. She had heard it before. She had defended victims of this before. But tonight, she was the one being profiled. "What's your name?" she asked. "The one asking questions is me," he snapped. And before she could respond, his hand gripped her wrist, twisting it painfully behind her back. The crack in her shoulder made her wince, but she didn't scream. She bit down, hard, lips trembling, but not from fear. He shoved her face first against the hood of his car, cold steel pressing into her cheek. "You people always think you're special," he hissed. "You think you don't have to follow the rules." Danielle didn't reply. She couldn't. Her mouth was against the hood. Her breath fogged the surface. and with it, years of quiet compliance vanished. She let him cuff her, let him shove her into the back of the car, let him drive her to the station in silence, humming to himself like he'd just bagged a trophy. She sat in the back seat like she wasn't someone who had graduated top of her class at Harvard Law, like she wasn't one of the highest-ranking federal prosecutors in the state, like she hadn't spent the last year building a confidential investigation into crooked cops, Greg Lawson included. In holding, her wrist throbbed from the force he used. Her cheek burned from the scrape against the car, but nothing hurt more than the realization that no matter how hard she had worked, how much she had achieved, to him she was just another black body to dominate. She was processed like a criminal, fingerprinted, photographed. The female officer who took her photo barely looked her in the eye. "You don't have a record. Must be your lucky night," she said, mocking. Danielle said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, but because her silence was a weapon. She was gathering evidence, observing every second, storing every word and bruise like ammunition. That night, she slept, if it could be called that, on a metal bench with a flickering light overhead. No blanket, no explanation. Just the hollow ache of systemic betrayal echoing off concrete walls. And still, she waited. At dawn, the station phone rang. Then again. And again. Within an hour, chaos rippled through the department like a storm. The chief marched in, red-faced and breathless. Danielle was pulled from her cell without explanation. Her belongings were returned in silence. She asked for her phone. No one argued. She called her office. The rest, as they say, was history. Greg Lawson was summoned to the captain's office, still smug, still clueless. He strolled in, assuming he'd get a pat on the back for doing his job. "That woman you arrested," the captain said, trembling. "That woman is Danielle Rhodes, federal prosecutor, leading the investigation into this department, including you." The folder slammed onto the desk with the weight of 1,000 secrets. Inside it were reports, testimonies, allegations, videos, names. Lawson's name circled in red ink. Greg's face drained. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. No clever excuse, no smug joke, just silence. The very silence he had forced upon his victims for years. That moment was the beginning of the end. When the news broke, the media exploded. Federal prosecutor wrongfully arrested by cops she was investigating. Danielle's photo was everywhere, stern, composed, a symbol of both trauma and triumph. But the real reckoning came in court. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, protesters, victims of Lawson's past brutality. Some sat in silent solidarity. Others clutched tissues, remembering their own nightmarish encounters. Greg took the stand, now pale, sweating, shrinking. Gone was the predator. All that remained was a man cornered by his own corruption. Then Danielle stood. She didn't shout, didn't rage. She didn't need to. Her voice, steady, factual, with just enough tremor to remind the jury of the pain beneath, was more powerful than fury. She described everything. The arrest, the humiliation, the way his hand dug into her wrist like he was trying to erase her identity. And then she played the footage. The body cam, the dash cam, the station footage. There it was, Greg's voice, venomous. "You people think you can mouth off." There was her face, bruised. Her wrists red and swollen. Gasps echoed. A juror wiped tears. The judge leaned forward. Greg Lawson looked like he might vomit. But Danielle wasn't finished. One by one, more witnesses were called. A young man beaten during a traffic stop. A mother whose son was framed. An ex-officer who testified, voice shaking, about how Greg had pressured rookies to handle minorities differently. Each story added weight to the noose tightening around Lawson's career. Danielle watched it all, her expression never breaking, because she couldn't afford to fall apart. Not yet. After 2 brutal weeks, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Greg's knees buckled as the officers he once called brothers slapped cuffs on him. Danielle stood silently. Her eyes met his. No triumph, no gloating, just justice. But this wasn't the end. It was the opening salvo in a war she had prepared for. With Lawson convicted, the department scrambled to contain the fallout. But Danielle pushed forward. She released reports, filed motions, reopened closed cases. She had become a force, unrelenting, fearless, unbreakable. Greg's old allies turned on him, testifying to save themselves. Behind bars, he became a ghost of the monster he once was. And Danielle? She became a symbol. For every woman ignored, for every black citizen brutalized, for every victim told to stay silent. She had taken her pain and turned it into a sword. But it cost her. Nightmares, anxiety, moments when she couldn't breathe, remembering that cold metal hood on her cheek. But she kept going. Not for herself, but for the ones who couldn't. And the message was clear. If you abuse your power, she's coming. And the next time, it might be your name circled in red. This has been another unforgettable story brought to you by A1 Storyteller, where truth meets courage and injustice is met with fire. If Danielle's story moved you, if it made you angry or gave you hope, don't just scroll past. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that expose darkness and honor those brave enough to fight it. Until next time, stay aware, stay strong, and keep fighting for what's right. The courtroom buzzed with a low, nervous energy as people shuffled into their seats, clutching notepads, phones, and whispered opinions. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the weight of long-suppressed truths and the looming promise of justice. Everyone had heard the name Officer Greg Lawson, a man both feared and protected, someone whose badge had become a shield not just from bullets, but from consequences. For years, he had terrorized the very citizens he had sworn to protect, especially those with black skin and bold voices. And for years he walked free, smiling behind patrol car windows, confident that no one could touch him. But this day was different. This day, the air was tense, not because of what Greg Lawson would say, but because of who had finally come to speak against him. And as the crowd settled, all eyes turned to the front row where a woman sat upright, calm, and impossibly composed. Her name was Danielle Rhodes, and though most in the room saw her as just another black woman seeking justice, Officer Lawson knew better. He had cuffed her, dragged her, insulted her, humiliated her. He thought she was powerless. He had no idea that she was a federal prosecutor, a Harvard law graduate, and the lead investigator in a quiet, powerful probe against officers like him. And now, the woman he once shoved face first onto a police car hood had come to return the favor, with truth, with evidence, and with the full force of justice. Lawson adjusted his uniform, trying to appear calm, but his jaw tightened when Danielle rose from her seat. Her heels clicked against the polished courtroom floor like a war drum, each step reminding him of the mistake he made when he chose to profile her instead of protect her. She took the stand and sat slowly, every movement measured. But beneath the poise was a heart still wounded, a woman still carrying the invisible bruises from that night. The sting of cold metal on her face, the snap of her shoulder when he twisted her arm, the burning humiliation of being treated like less than human. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and in that gaze was not vengeance, but clarity, the kind that burns deeper than rage. "Officer Lawson?" she began, her voice unwavering but rich with restrained emotion. "Do you remember the night of June 14th? Greg shifted uncomfortably. "I don't recall the details," he mumbled. Danielle's face didn't change. "Let me help you," she said, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, I have video footage." The room fell deathly silent. The judge nodded. A large screen came to life. Gasps echoed from every corner. There it was. Clear, raw, undeniable. Greg Lawson manhandling her, barking insults like she was an animal, twisting her arms, throwing her into the back seat. On the video, her voice remained calm, even as she was assaulted. On the screen, he snarled, "You people always think you're clever." The camera caught her wince, the tightening of her lips, the pain in her eyes. In that moment, the courtroom stopped being just a room. It became a mirror, and everyone was forced to look at what was really reflected there. The judge's expression darkened. The jury whispered. Some audience members wiped away tears, and Greg Lawson, once cocky and unshakable, sat frozen, eyes darting, throat dry. Danielle turned back to him slowly. "Do you recall now?" she asked, soft but piercing. Lawson swallowed hard. For the first time, the man who once wielded fear like a baton had nothing to say. But Danielle wasn't finished. Not even close. What the video didn't show was what came after. The emotional wounds. The nights she couldn't sleep without seeing flashing lights behind her eyelids. The humiliation of being fingerprinted, her mugshot taken like she was a criminal instead of a protector of justice. The moment she broke down alone in her car after being released, clutching her wrist, sobbing not from pain, but from the sheer magnitude of what it meant, that even she, accomplished, brilliant, composed, could be reduced to nothing in the eyes of a racist officer. She told the court about the moment her captain learned her identity, the scramble of phone calls, the desperate apologies, and her choice to say nothing. Until now. "I let it happen," she said quietly, the courtroom holding its breath, "because I needed the truth. I needed to show you, show everyone, what happens when people like Officer Lawson believe they're above the law. What happens when power goes unchecked." Witnesses came forward next. A teenage boy, now 20, trembling as he recalled being slammed to the ground for jaywalking. A mother who wept, remembering her 12-year-old son pulled from his bicycle and accused of theft. A former police trainee who admitted he left the force because he couldn't stomach what Greg taught rookies to do to keep control of black neighborhoods. Each voice added another weight to the growing pile of evidence. Each story painted a damning portrait of a man who believed his badge was a license to dehumanize. And Danielle sat through it all, steady, though every word sliced deeper into her spirit. Because for every testimony given, she saw a reflection of herself, someone who had been violated, humiliated, and expected to forget it. But she would not forget. Not now. Not ever. The trial stretched 2 long weeks. Every night, Danielle went home to an apartment she no longer felt safe in. She triple-checked her locks. She left lights on in every room. She started sleeping with her phone on her chest, afraid she might wake up to retaliation. The stress took a toll, her eyes sunken, hands trembling slightly. But she never let the courtroom see it, because she knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about her. It was about the community, about the people still too afraid to come forward, about the future officers watching this case to know what justice could really mean. And when the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, the room erupted. Some clapped, others cried. But Danielle, She just exhaled. Not a sigh of relief, but of release. A breath she'd been holding for months, years even. Greg Lawson was led away in cuffs, the same way he had led so many others, but this time, he wasn't the one with the power. Danielle stood and turned to the cameras, not to bask in glory, but to send a message. One louder than any siren. Justice is not blind. It just needed a voice. Her voice. And now it had it. But she knew the battle wasn't over. After the trial, the media exploded with praise. Her inbox flooded with thank yous, with other victims wanting to come forward. But with praise came threats. Letters slipped under her door. Anonymous phone calls. "You made a mistake, Rhodes," one voice warned. But Danielle didn't flinch. She doubled her security. She filed reports. And she kept going. Because fear had already stolen too much from her, and she refused to give it another inch. Today, Danielle Rhodes continues to fight. Not just in court, but in every hallway, every community center, every whisper of a mother afraid to let her son walk alone. Her victory is not just legal, it's symbolic. She is proof that truth matters, that courage wins, that even in a broken system, light can pierce through. This has been another unforgettable true story from A1 Storyteller, where heroes aren't always wearing capes. Sometimes they wear bruises. Sometimes they sit quietly in courtrooms, waiting for the right moment to speak. And when they do, the world listens. If Danielle's story moved you, if her pain became your anger, and her strength became your hope, then let her know she's not alone. Like this video, comment your support, and subscribe to this channel so her voice, and others like hers, never fade. Stand with Danielle. Stand for truth. Because the fight for justice is far from over, and heroes like her need us more than ever. The verdict was in. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, a collective breath held by every person packed into the gallery, hanging on a thread that was about to snap. We, the jury, find the defendant, Greg Lawson, guilty on all counts. The words dropped like a hammer, crashing through the once impenetrable shield of corruption that Officer Lawson had worn for years like a second skin. The room erupted. Some gasped, some cheered, some wept. But in the very center of it all sat one woman who didn't move, Danielle Rhodes. Calm, silent, unshaken. Her eyes were locked on Lawson, watching the disbelief unravel across his face, as if he still couldn't comprehend how everything he had built, his fear-driven legacy, his intimidation tactics, his lies, had come undone in just 2 weeks. But what no one in that courtroom knew, what they couldn't possibly understand yet, was that this trial, this moment, this public fall from grace, it had been years in the making, and the woman behind it had risked everything, literally everything, her career, her freedom, even her life. And she had done it in such a way that no one saw it coming. To the casual observer, Danielle was simply the federal prosecutor who had taken a high-profile police brutality case and turned it into a landmark conviction. But the truth? It ran deeper than anyone imagined. Much deeper. And it started long before the flashing lights on that dark street. Long before Greg Lawson wrongfully arrested her, long before he sneered, "You people," and threw her into the back of a patrol car like she didn't matter. Danielle had already been watching him, studying him, waiting. What the world didn't know, what not even her own colleagues in the Justice Department fully grasped, was how far she had gone to make this happen. She hadn't just investigated Greg Lawson. She had infiltrated the system around him. 2 years earlier, Danielle had received an anonymous tip from an internal source, a rookie officer who had lasted barely 4 months on the force before quitting in horror. He'd written one sentence in his message: "Greg Lawson's running a gang with a badge." At first, it sounded like an exaggeration, but Danielle had learned early in her career that exaggerations often hid uncomfortable truths. She began digging, carefully, quietly. But what she uncovered wasn't just misconduct, it was a cancer, an organized, coordinated effort to suppress complaints, destroy body cam footage, and discredit victims, particularly black ones. It wasn't just Lawson. It was a network, and exposing it would require more than paperwork and subpoenas. It would require playing a role. So Danielle did the unthinkable. She embedded herself into the very streets Greg Lawson patrolled. Disguised as an ordinary citizen, she frequented gas stations, parks, liquor stores, anywhere his unit was known to lurk. She used burner phones, changed her appearance, kept her real name locked away. It was a gamble unlike anything she'd attempted before. She risked being recognized. She risked being caught. And then one night it happened. She was walking home after attending a late-night meeting with a local activist group when the flashing lights came. Lawson pulled up. She didn't run. Didn't flash a badge. She let it happen. She let him arrest her, let him spit venom in her face, let him drag her down into the system she knew she had to expose. Because she knew that in order to bring him down, she needed irrefutable proof. And now she had it. Not as a lawyer, not as a bystander, but as a victim. But that was only the beginning. Once released from custody, Danielle disappeared for 3 days. She told no one where she was, not even her supervisors. What she did during those 72 hours remains shrouded in mystery, even now. Some say she traveled across state lines to secure evidence from a former officer in hiding. Others believe she met with a journalist she trusted to leak documents if she vanished. What is known is that when she returned, she had a file that would eventually be submitted into evidence. A file that contained body cam backups Lawson thought were erased. Handwritten statements from other victims who feared retaliation, and financial records that hinted at something even darker: extortion, protection rackets, possibly even ties to a judge. But Danielle stayed quiet. She didn't leak it. She didn't scream. She waited, patiently, meticulously, because she knew the system wouldn't allow truth to breathe unless it was suffocating with facts. And then the trial began. At first, no one suspected the depth of what was coming. The prosecution's opening statement was strong, but standard. Danielle didn't reveal her cards. She watched the jury, studied the defense. And when the time was right, when Lawson smirked on the stand and claimed, "I've never treated anyone unfairly," that's when she dropped the hammer. She stood up, turned to the judge, and simply said, "Your Honor, I have new evidence." The file hit the table like thunder. The room went still. The defense team panicked. The judge asked for a recess, but it was already too late. The evidence was a ticking bomb. The footage, vivid, brutal, undeniable, played across the screen. The audio of Lawson calling her a smart-mouthed black beach rang through the courtroom like a war cry. One juror covered their mouth in horror. The gallery was silent, not even the sound of breathing. And then came the testimonies Danielle had gathered, secretly at great personal risk, from people who had been too afraid to come forward before. They told stories that mirrored hers, each more horrifying than the last. A pattern emerged, a pathology, and the jury saw it. That's when Greg Lawson cracked. Not in public, not on the stand, but behind closed doors, word got out that he had broken down, weeping, screaming about betrayal. He had no idea how she knew so much. He accused fellow officers, his own lawyer, even the judge. Because deep down, Greg Lawson knew the truth. That Danielle Rhodes hadn't just prosecuted him. She had outsmarted him at every turn. She had walked into the very den of wolves and dared them to try and tear her apart. And now, here he was. Cuffed. Defeated. Small. As he was led out of the courtroom, head down, Danielle stood, not with pride, but with purpose. She didn't smile, didn't wave. She simply stood as a reminder that even when systems fail, even when justice feels out of reach, there are still people willing to risk everything to bring the truth to light. But make no mistake, she paid a price. The threats began within days. Letters slid under her door, her car tires slashed. A man approached her in a parking garage and whispered, "You should have kept your mouth shut." She changed apartments, got security cameras. For weeks, she barely slept. Paranoia stalked her like a shadow. And yet, she never backed down. She kept showing up, kept answering phone calls from victims, kept filing cases. Because if she didn't, who would? And now, she needs you. Yes, you, the one listening, the one watching, the one who felt their heart race as she walked up to the witness stand, the one who felt rage bubble when Lawson laughed on camera, the one who whispered yes when the verdict was read. She needs your voice, your comment, your encouragement, because the system doesn't cheer for people like her. It tries to crush them. So if you believe in what she did, if you admire the risk she took, leave a comment below. Let her know her courage mattered. Let her know the pain she endured wasn't for nothing. Let her know we see her. And more importantly, we stand with her. This has been another gripping true story brought to you by A1 Storyteller, where truth meets bravery and justice has a face. If Danielle Rhodes moved you, shocked you, or gave you hope, don't stay silent. Like this video, share it. Subscribe for more stories of real people risking everything for what's right. And don't forget, comment below to tell Danielle she's not alone. She fought the darkness so we could see the light. The least we can do is let her know the world was watching, and we will never forget what she did. The headlines came fast, bold, screaming, electric. Federal prosecutor takes down corrupt officer. The woman who refused to stay silent. Danielle Rhodes, the face of modern justice. But those who celebrated the verdict, who shared the videos and left clapping emojis in the comments, didn't know half of it. They didn't know the truth about what Danielle had endured behind closed doors. They hadn't seen the bruises under her coat, the shaking in her hands, or the way she flinched every time she saw flashing red and blue lights, even long after Officer Greg Lawson was found guilty. They didn't know what it had cost her. They just saw the end, the moment she stood in court, head held high, watching the man who once dragged her through the mud, now being led away in chains. But the journey to that courtroom wasn't paved with applause. It was carved in pain, in silence, in unbelievable risk. And the truth? The real, raw truth? It was far more powerful and heartbreaking than anything that could fit in a headline. Danielle Rhodes had spent years fighting for justice in a system designed to wear her down. Every case, every file, every late-night meeting in dimly lit rooms with terrified witnesses, she had carried them all like a soldier carrying the names of fallen comrades. And when she first heard the name Greg Lawson, it was just another file. Another name in a long list of bad cops who had slipped through the cracks. But it wasn't the name that haunted her. It was the pattern. Young black men being stopped without cause, body cams that malfunctioned, complaints that disappeared, mothers too scared to speak up. And at the center of it all, Lawson, smiling in every report like he knew the system would always protect him. Danielle could have passed the case to someone else. She could have buried it under safer priorities. But something about Lawson's smugness, his consistency, his violence cloaked in official language, ignited something in her. Something personal, something raw. But she never imagined she would become his target. That night, the night everything changed, wasn't supposed to be extraordinary. Danielle was walking home from a late meeting with a confidential informant. The streets were quiet. The air was still. And then suddenly, it wasn't. The sirens, the lights, the command. "You! Hands where I can see them!" She turned, instinctively raising her hands, thinking maybe it was a mistake. But when she saw him, Greg Lawson, stepping out of the patrol car, hand already on his holster, her stomach dropped. He didn't recognize her, not in the darkness, not out of context. To him, she was just another black woman alone at night. "You match the description of a suspect," he said with lazy confidence. "What description is that?" she asked calmly. "Black, female, breathing," he muttered, laughing. And before she could blink, her arm was twisted, her face pressed against the hood, the cold metal burning into her cheek. The words he spat were cruel, condescending. He called her smart-mouthed, told her she needed to be taught a lesson. And she let him. She let it all happen. Because in that terrifying moment, one that could have ended in tragedy, Danielle knew what most people didn't. This was her chance. She had already suspected him. Now she had become his victim. And that changed everything. She didn't resist. She didn't flash her badge or scream her title. She went into that holding cell like she was just another statistic, another file waiting to be stamped and forgotten. And it broke her. Not just physically, though the bruises on her wrist would last for weeks, but emotionally. She sat in that cell and cried quietly, so no one could hear. Cried for herself, for the hundreds of others who'd sat in those same cells with no power, no voice, and no one coming to help them. She cried because, for the first time in years, justice felt like a fantasy. But that's also when she made her decision. She would not run, she would not hide, she would not be broken. She would take this pain, this humiliation, this nightmare, and she would turn it into something no one could ignore. The next morning, chaos erupted at the precinct. Calls came in from the Department of Justice. Within the hour, Danielle was released. No apology, no explanation, just silence. And Lawson? He was summoned, still grinning, expecting maybe a write-up. What he got was a folder. Thick, heavy, deadly. Inside, her credentials, her photo, her investigation, and the message was clear. You arrested the wrong black woman. That moment sent shockwaves not just through the department, but through the entire city. Because when the public found out what happened, it wasn't just about Danielle. It was about everyone who had ever been stopped, searched, or silenced. People began to talk. The media picked up the story. Victims who had once kept their stories locked away began coming forward. And suddenly, what started as one arrest turned into an avalanche. Danielle didn't just testify at trial. She led a movement. She reopened old cases. She filed motions that shook police departments across the state. She walked into rooms where no woman like her had ever been invited and demanded accountability. She brought names, receipts, evidence. She exposed years of cover-ups. And behind every new document, every video file, every grainy photograph of bruises and broken bones was a person who had nearly lost hope. But even as the world rallied behind her, Danielle faced darkness most couldn't imagine. The threats came daily. Anonymous letters, late-night calls, a brick thrown through her apartment window. One day, she found the word traitor scrawled across her car in red paint. She was assigned security, but even that didn't bring comfort. The fear wasn't for herself. It was for her mother, her sister, her friends. Every time someone rang her doorbell, her heart skipped. Every shadow in a parking garage became a question mark. But she refused to stop. Because if she did, then what had it all been for? And then came the tipping point. Danielle submitted a list to the Department of Justice. A long one. It named officers, supervisors, even a judge. People who had enabled Greg Lawson's reign. And this time, there was no burying it. The case went national. Congressional hearings were launched. Federal oversight was placed on the department. And most shockingly of all, the city's police chief resigned on live television, citing moral failure and systemic rot. It was more than a victory. It was a reckoning. And yet through it all, Danielle never once celebrated. Because how could she? The faces of the victims were always with her. The mother who called her crying because her son's name had finally been cleared. The old man who whispered, "I thought I'd die before I saw justice." The young girl who hugged her after a town hall and said, "You're the reason I want to be a lawyer." These were the people she fought for. Not headlines, not trophies. People. Human beings who had been told for too long that their pain didn't matter. And maybe that's why her story has stayed with so many. Because Danielle didn't just change policy. She changed hearts. She made people believe that courage could still cut through the darkness. That one voice, no matter how battered, could still roar. That even when the system fails you, there is always a way to fight back. So now, we turn to you. Yes, you. The one listening. The one who just felt chills as the verdict echoed in your ears. The one who cried when you heard what she went through. The one who clenched your fists when he twisted her arm. Danielle Rhodes walked through fire to make the world just a little brighter. And she did it without asking for praise. So let's give it to her now. If you believe in what she did, if you felt her pain, her power, her purpose, leave a comment. Tell her she's not alone, that we saw her, that we thank her, that we stand behind her. This has been another unforgettable story brought to you by A1 Storyteller, where truth meets courage and justice has a name. Like, comment, subscribe, and never forget, one voice can change the world. And sometimes that voice wears bruises beneath a tailored suit and still shows up to fight. That voice is Danielle Rhodes, and the fight isn't over. But now, she knows she's not fighting alone. The courtroom victory was supposed to be the end, the final chapter in a long, painful book of injustice. When the judge read the guilty verdict, when Greg Lawson was taken away in handcuffs, when the jury foreman looked Danielle Rhodes in the eyes with silent respect, many believed it was over. The headlines said justice had been served. The social media posts celebrated her as a hero. But the truth? That wasn't the end of the story. In fact, for Danielle, it was only the beginning. Because taking down one officer didn't stop the others. It didn't erase the scars or silence the threats. What no one saw, what the world didn't report, was how quickly her life spiraled into a maze of danger, betrayal, and fear. And yet, through every dark night, every broken moment, Danielle held her ground, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she refused to let fear win. And that choice, to stand her ground when everything around her tried to break her, was the most heroic part of her story. In the weeks following Lawson's conviction, Danielle returned to work thinking she could finally breathe. But the air was different now. Thicker. Colder. Eyes lingered longer. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Her badge still carried weight, but now it carried something else, too. Resentment. There were whispers in the hallways. She went too far. She made us look bad. She's the reason the media's all over us. Colleagues she once trusted turned distant. Some openly questioned her methods. Why didn't you report the arrest right away? Why did you go public? Danielle swallowed the pain, knowing that behind their criticisms was a deeper truth. They were afraid, because her victory had shaken the foundation. It had shown the world that justice wasn't a myth, and some people, especially those with something to hide, found that terrifying. The threats started subtly. A slashed tire. An envelope taped to her door with no return address, and the words, "We're watching you," scribbled in red marker. Then came the emails, anonymous, filled with racial slurs, explicit threats, and vile promises of retaliation. Danielle forwarded them to the feds, who opened a protective detail around her. But that didn't ease her mind. She started checking her locks 3 times before bed. She changed her route to work. She stopped jogging at night. And yet, even in the shadow of fear, she refused to disappear. She showed up to court. She met with victims. She pushed forward with investigations. Because the moment she gave in would be the moment they won. And Danielle Rhodes had never been the kind of woman who backed down. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a rainy Thursday, the kind of night where most people stayed indoors. Danielle was reviewing case files in her apartment when the power cut out. Total darkness. Her heart raced. She reached for her phone, only to find it dead. Battery drained, even though she'd charged it hours ago. That's when she heard it. A sound at the window. A low, deliberate rattle. She froze. Every instinct screamed that she was in danger. She moved silently to her bedroom, heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed the small emergency phone hidden in her drawer and dialed her security contact. It took them 12 minutes to arrive. When they did, the window had been cracked open. A boot print smeared across the sill. But whoever had been there was gone. That night, Danielle didn't sleep. She sat in her living room with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, she made a decision. She wouldn't just react to threats. She would expose them. She called a press conference and stood before flashing cameras with calm fury. "Let me be clear," she said. "I will not be silenced. I will not be scared into submission, and I will not stop fighting for the people this system has failed." Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled behind the podium. And yet that single speech sent waves across the country. More victims came forward. Whistleblowers emerged from precincts that had long buried their secrets. Danielle was no longer just a prosecutor. She had become a symbol, a force, a living, breathing reminder that truth could not be hidden forever. But the work came with a heavy cost. Danielle was invited to speak at a university panel. As she stepped off the stage, a man approached her, smiling. "Big fan," he said. She nodded politely. Then he leaned in and whispered, "You should have stayed quiet." She flinched. Security moved in. The man disappeared into the crowd. Incidents like that became common. Grocery store strangers giving her dirty looks. An online rumor that she had fabricated her arrest. People she'd never met calling her dangerous, divisive, a threat to law and order. And through it all, she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, because giving up wasn't an option. And then, another twist. One day, a box arrived at her office. No return address. Inside were old case files, photos, and a letter. They covered this up. "Help us." Danielle recognized the handwriting. It belonged to an officer who had testified during the Lawson trial. He had gone quiet afterward. Now she knew why. The files revealed something bigger. A ring of officers who had been protecting each other for over a decade. Fabricated reports, destroyed evidence, false charges, victims jailed for crimes they didn't commit. This was bigger than Lawson. It was a network. And now Danielle had the key to bring it down. But it wouldn't be easy. Some of the people named in those files held power. Real power. District attorneys, judges, political donors. Going after them would mean lighting a match in a forest full of dry leaves. She met with her supervisor. "You're playing with fire," he said. She nodded. "Then I hope you brought water." And just like that, she began building a new case. Quietly, carefully, gathering names, interviewing victims, documenting cover-ups. She worked late into the night, often in total silence, the only sound the soft whir of her desktop fan and the quiet hum of justice building itself, piece by piece. Months passed. The case expanded. Investigations were opened. Resignations began. And Danielle? She kept her head down, not for fear, but for focus. Because she knew that every time someone doubted her, every time someone told her to stop, they were handing her more fuel, more reason to keep going. And finally, it happened. A series of federal indictments were unsealed. 13 officers, 2 judges, 1 city councilman. The news broke like a dam, flooding the country with shock. And at the center of it all? Danielle Rhodes. The woman they once tried to frame. The woman they once called a liar. The woman who sat in a holding cell with cuffs on her wrists and turned that pain into a revolution. She sat quietly in her office that night, watching the news coverage. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Reporters, victims, supporters, strangers. But she didn't answer. She just watched and cried. Not loud, not sobbing, just soft, silent tears for the victims, for the battles still to come, for herself. Because this time, it felt different. The system wasn't healed. Not yet. But it had been cracked open. And now the light was finally getting in. And now we ask you, the listener, the witness to her journey, what will you do with this story? Will you stay silent? Will you scroll past? Or will you stand up, like Danielle did, against fear, against injustice, against a system that too often breaks the very people it should protect? Leave a comment. Tell her you believe her. Tell her she's not alone. Because heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear bruises. Sometimes they wake up with fear and still choose to fight. And sometimes their greatest weapon is their refusal to be quiet. This has been another powerful, soul-stirring story from A1 Storyteller. If Danielle Rhodes' journey moved you, if her courage inspired you, like, comment, and subscribe for more true stories that pull back the curtain on justice, pain, and hope. And remember, change doesn't begin in courtrooms, it begins with truth. And truth begins with you. And when the dust finally settled, when the indictments were signed, the crooked officials removed, the files unsealed, and the victims' names cleared, it was a quiet, cool morning when Danielle Rhodes finally stood on the courthouse steps, alone for the first time in a long time. There were no crowds that day, no cameras, No microphones. Just her. Standing in the early sunlight, eyes closed, breathing deep. Not because everything had been fixed, not because her mission was over, but because she had reached something deeper than justice. She had reached truth. And truth, when earned the hard way, becomes a kind of peace. It had taken everything, her strength, her privacy, her safety. It had nearly broken her. But in the end, she hadn't just exposed one corrupt officer. She had pulled back the curtain on an entire system, piece by piece, until it collapsed under its own weight. She had been threatened, followed, and betrayed. But she never backed down. Not once. And now, the very system that tried to bury her stood transformed by the courage of a woman they underestimated from the start. Danielle would go on to help build a task force for internal police accountability, working alongside community leaders and young law students who saw her as a beacon of hope. The same woman who once sat bruised and silent in a holding cell now walked through the halls of power with her head high and her purpose clear. Her work became national. She testified before Congress. She helped rewrite policy. But more than that, she listened. She listened to mothers, to sons, to community members who had given up on justice until she gave them reason to believe again. She didn't just reform the law, she restored faith in it. And yet, Danielle never let the world forget what started it all. That night on a quiet street, when she was seen not as a person, but as a target. When an officer with too much pride and too little humanity slammed her against cold steel and thought he could erase her voice. But instead of breaking, she waited. She gathered. She remembered. And then she fought, not with rage, but with purpose. Not with fists, but with facts. And in doing so, she reminded the world of a truth that too often gets drowned in noise. Real strength is quiet. It's patient. And it's relentless. The people who once doubted her, they now quote her. The ones who feared her voice, they now follow her lead. And Danielle, ever humble, doesn't chase the spotlight. She never asked to be a symbol. But sometimes the fire chooses its flame bearer, and the flame chose her. But what does her story teach us? It teaches us that justice is not passive. It doesn't come just because we wish for it. It must be fought for, defended, protected, even when it's inconvenient or frightening. It teaches us that your voice matters, even when others try to silence it. That one person, determined and grounded in truth, can shake the walls of institutions that have stood for decades. Danielle's journey shows us that pain can become power when we refuse to give up. That courage doesn't mean not being afraid. It means choosing to act in spite of fear. It also reminds us that we all have a role to play. You don't have to be a prosecutor or a public official to stand for what's right. Sometimes it's as simple as speaking up, listening, believing someone when they say, "I was hurt," supporting victims, challenging injustice in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in our conversations. Because every great change begins small, one decision, one voice, one brave act at a time. Danielle's story is not just about what happened to her. It's about what she did with it. And in the end, that's what makes her powerful. She could have stayed silent. She could have taken the settlement, walked away, and never looked back. But she chose the harder path, the lonelier path, the one that demanded everything and gave back something no one could take: legacy. So if her story touched you, if it made your heart race, your eyes well up, or your hands clench in anger, then don't keep that inside. Tell her. Let her know you see her. Let her know she matters. Leave a comment below. Send her love. Say thank you. Because behind the courtroom footage and breaking news, Danielle Rhodes is still a human being. A woman who cried in the dark, who feared for her life, and who still got up and did the work anyway. She deserves your voice now. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, if you want the truth to rise, if you want to be part of a community that stands for justice, hope, and healing, then subscribe to A1 Storyteller. Because we're not just telling stories, we're lifting lives. We're honoring heroes who walk among us. We're reminding the world that no matter how dark things get, light always fights back. So here's what we ask you to do right now. Leave a comment to show Danielle your support. Your words matter more than you know. Like this video if her courage moved you. Share this story with someone who needs to believe that justice is still possible. Subscribe to A1 Storyteller so you never miss another story of bravery, truth, and transformation. Because if Danielle's journey taught us anything, it's this. The world doesn't change on its own. But when one person dares to speak, to stand, to resist, others will rise too. Be part of that rise. Be part of the light. And to Danielle Rhodes, wherever you are tonight, thank you. We see you, we believe you, and we will never stop telling your story. Until next time, stay strong, stay aware, and never stop fighting for what's right.